talking about the return. Last week, we started this. Today is part two. This is called The Return, part two, Home Again. And we're going to just review here for a quick second. Jesus brought to humanity three simple things that in their simplicity they become profound. The first is a revelation of God whom he called Father. Now, the reason why he called him Father was to make the connection between the source of all creation and his creation. In all religions, especially in the known world at the time, around that area, God and humanity are always at a distance. Always wondering what the gods were going to do. Whether you're a monotheist or a polytheist and anything in between, that was really the case. Jesus came and brought a different picture. Now the challenge is, at the same time, when we think Father, because the next part is, the next thing that Jesus brought to us is a revelation of us, whom he called mother, brother, sister, and friends. So the thing is he's using terms for them in that day that would speak to them because they would never connect God as their Father. Our challenge today is when we connect God as Father, we actually start reinterpreting what the Father is in the spiritual sense. There is a difference. Ultimately, it came down to a revelation that to know God was to know ourselves, and thus we would find they're one and the same. Ultimately, our oneness with the Creator and creation was and is the revelation. There is no us and them. There's only us. The challenge is communicating that reality to those of us that believe there is a them, a those, and the others. Because right away, one of the challenges I know I've found in sharing with folks sometimes is when they believe that there's a them, a those, and the others. When they believe that, all of a sudden I'm maybe one of those and them. And it's hard to communicate. So what you've come to find out after a while is when it comes to spirituality, there's a saying that I think really applies, and that's this. When the student is ready, the teacher will come. Yeah. What we've done in the evangelical church is ready and not, here we come. Yeah. And because of that, and most of the time, we weren't ready to go. Right. But that's another story. Last week, we spoke of leaving Eden. We're going to pick up a little bit, do a review, and pick up and then add something to it and then go on to the focus of today. But it requires some work to get there. Today is Home Again, part two. And then next week, we're going to talk about the Father. Yes, it's Father's Day, but you will find that there's some differences between natural fathering and spiritual fathering. There is some differences. I'm not going to be drawing those contrasts. I'm just going to name and stay focused on the spirituality element. So, if we return back to last time, part one, we talked about leaving Eden. We compared our traditional view to what Jesus taught, and we found critical differences. The challenge with modern Christianity, especially over the last 500 years, is we're like a drug addict that has a propensity to relapse. We relapse back to the very things that we were empowered to leave behind. Last lesson, in summary, we found that God created this creature called desire, also known as the Adam. And he gave him a choice, one to receive and give an intimate relationship with his Creator or just receive for himself alone. The first was the ultimate pleasure in the Garden of Pleasures. We commonly call the Garden of Eden. You understand, the Garden of Eden, the phrase Eden means pleasures. I mean, you've been created for pleasure. To receive it as well as to give it. And it's interesting on how most of our spiritual life then in most religious systems is about suppressing pleasures. Now, I'm not opposed to suppressing egoistic pleasure. But compassionate pleasure and all the pleasures that come from divinity is a whole different story. This pleasure of giving and receiving and intimacy with God is called the tree of life. This giving and receiving lovingly together to the point where you can't tell them apart, this is called image and likeness. Because the very action of giving makes you like God. The real key is, which was the whole point, you always have been and always will be like God, irrespective of what you do. Most of the time when we do stuff that seems to be contrary to that character is because we've forgotten who we are, not because we're trying to become something. Does that make sense? Now the contrast that was presented also, the direct opposite was the desire to receive for itself. It became self-centered, egoistic, and the pleasure it desired was called the knowledge of good and evil. It was not based in love, light, and life. Rather, it would be based on the knowing of good and evil, right and wrong. The purpose of the choice was the fulcrum where genuine love was and is created. There had to be, you can either receive for yourself or receive and give. Had to be that choice. We call it the two trees. We, like God, are in a sense creators also. We were given the choice to create a love relationship or the choice to create a selfish life. But the central aspect was still the desire to receive. So in every moment, there was the choice. You know, another religious duplicity is that we made a choice for Christ years ago, and now that because we've checked the right spiritual box, we're going to heaven, we got a heavenly ticket, and life is great. This is not about going to heaven. Actually, it's about revealing heaven. You see, every day, every moment in this world, we're still choosing between that egoistic, self-centered, serpentine, serpent self or the divine nature, Christ-likeness. Again, this has nothing to do with obtaining salvation, but everything with revealing it. From that choice, there arose a desire to know the other, the knowledge of good and evil. And thus God gave the Adam, he gave us total liberty to indulge in that world, and what we commonly call the fall occurred. If you remember last week, he didn't ridicule Adam for partaking of the tree. No. Matter of fact, in Jesus' description, he said, okay, so you want your inheritance? Here, go ahead, take it. You want to leave? Okay, no problem, stay as long as you can until you sell what you got, then you can go. Very different than maybe what we've thought we've been taught, or worse. The result of this egoistic reception, this serpent-type quality, the vessel called the Adam shattered into all these different pieces, and each of these pieces are spread throughout the world, and some of us are sitting right here. And it says that in Jeremiah and Isaiah, and this physical world as we know it came into being. We were then clothed in flesh, and the Hebrew phrase there is kadnut or, which many times we've said God killed an animal and clothed us. That's not true. The Bible, first of all, doesn't say that. Kadnut or is this. This is what you're in right now. This is your kadnut or. This is the flesh you're clothed in. This is the product of ego at its best. This entire world system is built on right and wrong, good and evil perspectives. And it's all self-centered, so it's always on a sliding scale. Always. You may have heard me give this example before, but I think it plays out when you have the zebra grazing in the field, or zebra for my South African friends. The zebra. They say it right, actually. We're the ones that don't say it right, but that's another story. So the zebra's out there, and then there's the lioness. And all of a sudden the lioness goes after the zebra. And the zebra is running away, and finally the lioness grabs it. And if you could hear them pray, the zebra will be saying, "Dear Lord, help me. The devil has got me. The lion is consuming me. Save me from this evil." And if you heard the lion, it would be saying, "Thank you, Lord God, for providing for me today." The thing is, this egoistically is so subtle, we don't even realize we operate in it most of the time. In general, we found that there were two types of view. The first was the complete denial of God. This was the son that, in the prodigal son story, that left for the distant country, and thus was living in a far country, and there was the other son that created his own gods. Both sons left home. And even in the older son, where he had this religious God that he was serving, even some of those attributes are correct. Yet all of which were based in systems of right and wrong, good and evil. Don't forget servitude and sacrifice. This fleshly egoism, also known as the serpent, is the veil that hinders our ability to see true reality as it is. And as long as the ego, the serpent, the Satan, if you will, prevails, reality is distorted and limited. The Father released both sons into their respective worlds, trusting in their spiritual DNA. Now, if you go through your New Testament, many times it talks about God having faith, God having hope. And we never think about it on that terms. We just figure God must be certain all the time. You see, but when he gave us the will to choose, he had to have faith in something too. And where his faith went was in the very aspect of the fact that he created us in his image, and that would beckon us and call to us when we are even in our worst egoistic, coiled by the serpent state of being. Now, if I can, remember, these things in the Bible are what's called roots and branches. Remember that? Branches are, we use physical ideas to try to relate spiritual truths, but we have to divorce ourselves eventually from just the physical to obtain the spiritual truth, because if you hold on to the physical, you're always going to go right back into a religious way of thinking. The Apostle Paul in Galatians called it the allegory. So what I'd like to do for a moment is read from a lighter segment of the new Melchizedek book, Volume 2, Tree of Life Realities, that I wrote, or in the process of writing. This is from Chapter 6, Noah, the Righteous Pagan of Faith. Part 2, Seeing the Fall from the Perspective of the Tree of Death. So if I can, let's go to outer space for a minute. Because the way we have taught over the last quite a few hundred years, it's like God is on planet heaven, and we're exiled to the prison planet called Earth. And there, we're doing our time slaving away at mining dilithium crystals. Then someone secretly smuggles in a Star Trek-like communicator, and we call it the Holy Spirit. And it's used to radio Captain Jesus. Come on, everybody sing. Da, 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 da. There you go. My gosh, we're all Trek-infested people here. It's used to radio Captain Jesus, who is light years away on his starship, the USS Eternal Prize. Think about it. Think it through for a minute. Isn't that what it is all about? Getting the prize of eternity. We're on the winning team. All this stuff that we create, once again, da, 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 da. USS Eternal Prize. Captain Jesus is there. And we secretly communicate with him and the others exiled with us. We have to be careful plotting our escape and waiting for his coming We look for the rapture. I mean the transporter. We don't want the demonic-like Klingon guards to see us. Because if they do, they'll report us to Warden General Viklark. That's a real Klingon word. I looked it up in the Klingon dictionary, and it pertains to this message. So if you're into Klingon at all, look it up. It relates. Now, folks are starting to look right now. Can you wait till after I'm done? Thank you very much. And then finally, with a flash, he comes. The eternal prize at warp speed appears in the sky. And then with a shout we hear, "Beam them up, Scotty!" Or sounds like maybe the voice of a trumpet. And we're transported above the clouds. And what happens? We're whisked away. And we meet Captain Jesus. And depending upon your theology, he may say to report to sick bay for final cleansing before you can enter service. And tapping his Spirit Fleet insignia. You know, it makes that transmission sound, right? The channel opens and you hear, "Captain Jesus to the bridge. Red alert. All hands to battle stations. Phasers to maximum. Load photon torpedoes. Target Earth. We're going to rain down some hardcore judgment." If you think about it, that's what we've been taught. And it may have made a fun science fiction movie, but we've reduced our spirituality and divinely inspired scriptures to this. If you think about it, we actually made such movies. I decided to leave them behind. Understand the events of Genesis first are internal, eternal states. They're in states of being for both the creature and creator. They're all internal. Now you say, well, all inside just me? That's the problem. You think it's just you. Jesus said the kingdom is within you. In other words, this is huge. This is eternal. When you tap in here, you're touching into the eternal world. And these things are the eternal states within us. We're trying to put them out here. We're trying to look for them there. We're trying to look them under every rock. But actually, they're first within here. And until we see them here, we won't be able to perceive them anywhere else. From the Garden of Eden perspective, we chose the serpent, the egoistic life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, meaning we chose the will to receive for ourselves in the physical world as we know it came into being. And all that came with it: religion, politics, way of life, war. The curses that followed, the status of the angelic being that was supposedly to prevent us, we talked about this last week, from approaching the tree of life, were products not of God's punishment, but our choice. The scripture in Genesis, traditionally, which appears to seal the gate shut, tells us a lot more. This is that verse. Now, this is the NIV version, so, your version may read a little bit differently. But it says, "After you drove out the man, he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword, flashing back and forth to guard the way of the tree of life." Now, if you've been through Genesis Factor or read the Melchizedek book, you already possibly have an idea of where we're going to go with this. But I think it's worth talking about just for a moment before we get to the crux of this. In Hebrew, it looks like this. And that highlighted area, the yellow is hakrobim, that's the word for cherubim. Then you have va'et lachat hakarev, which is the flaming enchanting type sword. It's actually a dagger is really the word. It's not a sword like a long sword. It's more of a dagger. And the reason for it is when you think about this whole thing, then you even think about in the future, where Moses is actually writing all this, if you remember in Genesis. He's writing it, and he's getting this download from Mount Sinai, and he's putting this all together, and out of this comes the tabernacle or the temple. We have the temple, the tabernacle of Moses, and eventually the temple of Solomon. And in both of those cases, even the word tabernacle harkens to this verse right here. Because where he said he drove out the man and he placed, that phrase he placed, or from the place, is the Hebrew word meshkin, which is the word for tabernacle. So the tabernacle becomes a caricature of the spiritual condition of things. And to our surprise, many times, we find that the serpent, Satan, all that is very much in part of that temple as anything else. Oh no, it's supposed to be holy. Oh no, he's right there. Because we're there. Because it's us. Now you remember, if you went through Genesis Factory, if not, get the DVDs, get the book Melchizedek. Trust me, it'll help. But the key is there was something in that temple called the veil. And on the veil was the image of the cherubim. Now understand, hakrubim, cherubim in Hebrew means imaginary figure. An imagination. You say, well, I've seen angels. I'm sure you have. But what you saw was how you could relate to that. Because the hakrobim, the cherub, the imaginary, it would become anything, in this case, when it comes to the veil, it becomes anything that keeps you from seeing the truth. You want to get really technical, we found out in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 20, that the veil is called the flesh. That's what it says. So the fact that the veil is the flesh, you could say whatever we project limits our ability to see reality as it is. So the one side of that hakrubim, va'et lahat hakarev, one aspect is the projection that we put out that keeps us from seeing the tree of life. And what's interesting, though, is it's totally created by us. Now, there's more to it than just that. I'm going to tell you one little thing more about the cherubim in a minute, which is good news. But what's really interesting is it's all this rules, knowledge of good and evil based. You know, in 1 Samuel 4 through 5, it's kind of interesting. And then in 1 Chronicles 13, we have an interesting scenario. You've probably been heard, if you've been around Christianity, Judaism for a long time, you know that you just can't waltz into the Holy of Holies. If you waltz into the Holy of Holies, you can be struck dead. Here's the challenge. The Philistines waltzed right into the Holy of Holies, picked up the ark, and walked right out with it. Why? Because they didn't have any rules that told them they couldn't. As Paul said, the letter kills. It's the spirit that gives life. That didn't take away any of the power from what that presence was supposed to represent, because Dagon fell over a few times when they put it in the temple with him. But the point is, it didn't kill any of the Philistines at that point. As soon as David got a hold of it, he's dragging the ark back. What happens? Somebody touched it, he's instantly dead. Why? Because the rules said if you touch it, you die. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is the tree of death. And death has nothing to do with physical death. It's an illusion, a dream world of make-believe, if you will, and we're living in it. But it's so real to us, we'll fight over each other over it. Leave my illusion alone. The more you clothe that egoistic self, the more louder it becomes. Let me explain that for a minute. Get on the freeway and have somebody cut you off. Well, you blessed son of a somebody, hand sign languages out the window, right? How dare they cut me off? Right? We do that. Now, get us out of the car, because now you're encased in something more. Get out of the car, walk the street with somebody, and by accident somebody cuts you off. You don't go, you sick, and you move. Oh, sorry, I did that on church. But you know what? You all know what that is. Right? So we're all cussing and screaming at, but we would never do that if somebody cut us off in the hallway. It would be like, oh, excuse me. Oh, it's okay, no problem. Ego. No, you blur it out. Leave it in. This is church. We're talking about truth here. All right? How do I know? Because I've been that guy on the freeway. That's how I know. I've been the recipient as well as the deliverer of that message. Yes. Lord willing, I'm doing better now. From a divine love Christ point of view, the idea of leaving home, because this is about returning home, the leaving home and spending time in a distant country or a religion has a different connotation. It was us who made the choice, and it was us who left. God only kept his word and allowed us to go. Just like a person who doesn't want their lover to leave, but if their lover leaves, let's say they say, well, I need time to think about things. I'm not sure about this relationship. I just want to move out. And we've all seen those on TV. We've all maybe been in those relationships. The worst thing the one who loves them and wants them to stay could do is demand they stay. The worst thing their lover could do is tell them how wrong they are, or worse, threaten them if they leave. And yet that's what we think God does to us. You've heard me say it time and time again, but I love it. It just capsulizes how we've perverted the gospel message. God loved you so much that he created hell just in case you don't love him back. Instead, God actually helps us pack our bags. Maybe it's not the greatest moment, but it helps us get to where we want to go. From God's point of view, what happened? The Hebrew word for tree, by the way, is the same word to shut the eyes. You see, you can't have your eyes open to the tree of life and also open to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, although we try real hard in this world. Matter of fact, usually what we do is we take whatever little glimpse of the tree of life we had, and then we can pack it into the tree of knowledge and good and evil world system, and we start living out from there. It means to shut the eyes. So you're either going to have your eyes open to one or closed to the other. It's really never the same. As a result, when we partook, so if you consider this idea of shutting the eyes, it's like we fell asleep, a death sleep. And we've seen this in all different places. This sleep, this death sleep, this here, of course, surrounded in flames. Think of the notion of how the Hakrabim, the cherubim, how they're supposed to be ministers for flames, right? It says so in Hebrews, also says so in Psalms. These are just depictions of this, of the sleeping maiden, this Brunhilde particularly, the sleeping maiden surrounded in flames, encasing her, keeping her out and others from getting in. Total separation mindset. But we see this in other places, in Grimm's fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White. They're all telling us the same significant message, just in a different way. You know, the Apostle Paul quotes a hymn. Some scholars, like the 4th century bishop Epiphanius, if I said his name right, of Salmus, is taken from a lost prophecy of Elijah. And Paul quotes it in Ephesians 5:14. He says, listen to his words, "Awake you who sleep, arise from the dead." So sleeping, this state of living in the physical world only, with our 5 senses, is death and sleep. And Paul's saying, awake you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. I like what Francois did with the Greek text there. It really worked out well in Ephesians 5:14. He says, this is the message of the light. Christ awakens you from your intoxicated slumber and resurrects you out of the death trap of enslaved thought patterns, the imaginations. Now, Francois and I never talked about the cherubim imagination, although he evidently must have listened to the message last week, and he fired me a message on Facebook Messenger, which I'll mention in just a second about that cherubim, which I thought was really cool too. So I'll include that. But the point is that what's encased her is her imagination. What's interesting is In Mark 14:37, Jesus goes out to pray, if you remember, and he comes back and finds his disciples asleep. And he says, Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not have watched with me 1 hour? If you were to translate that into Hebrew, Shimon means the one who hears. And yeshin, which is the word for sleep, means to be in an altered state or unconsciousness. So in other words, my hearing is in a suspended state of consciousness, he's saying to him. Think of that. Shimon, Simon, are you sleeping? Simon, are you in an altered state of consciousness? Yes, we are. It's called ego. It's called serpent. It's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And Christ would have us awake from our sleep. Actually, if you want to be honest, the enchanted, what I like to call shapeshifter, turns and transforms. But what happens if we simply humble ourselves? We start to step away from egoism. Simply humble ourselves. Surrender to the love of God. What would happen to the true vision of God that Christ revealed to us in the Gospels? You know, it's that word there in Hebrew, which is the word for the transforming sword. And if you looked at each letter, it becomes very interesting. Because what we may have thought had been preventing us, if you just simply read that same verse, even in English with a different mindset, it's not that God put an angel preventing us from the tree of life, guarding. It's actually he's guarding the path for you so you can find it. Chet, Pei, Kaf. He means to look and see. It's a revelation. Pei is the mouth speaking, the oral Torah or the spoken word. And Kaf is the humble king bowed over with an open hand where potential is being realized. That's what those letters mean. All of a sudden, that takes on a different point of view. The encrypted message is this. No. Because we see the living word, the tree of life, when we humble ourselves, the path is open to us. The Greek word in the Septuagint, and this is what Francois sent me, is strepho for this segment, which means to return, to be converted. You could say he was guarding the path for you, not from you. Both sons in the prodigal son story were returning home. The religious one working in the field and the one from the pigsty in the distant country, the key was they had an interesting view of the Father. One in the pigsty said, and this is up at the top, verse 17, but when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father. I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Then, flash. Brother coming home. The one out in the field, that is. He's coming home. Celebration. The other brother's now home, okay? Now his older brother was in the field, and he came and drew near the house, heard the music and dancing. So he called to one of his servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and because he has received him safe and sound, your father has killed a fatted calf, but he was angry and not go in. Very powerful word here. But when he came to himself. Probably one of the most powerful statements in all of Jesus' parables. Some translations say, and he came to his senses. That's not bad, but it can be misleading on how you use that word. Because in the end, there is a using of the senses that happens here. Now, coming to one's senses can imply a rationalization and not necessarily a revelation of who the Father and we are. On the other hand, when we do see a coming to oneself as a revelation, many times it's in the making and gets mixed with the rationalization of the senses. This is why Paul said the spirit of the prophets is subject to the prophets. Why? Because even the prophetic we see, the people prophesying right now about all kinds of things, it still has to come through the lens of your belief system. And usually God is trying to work us out of that. But if you already start as, let's say, the older brother that has a point of view, regardless of what he hears. He's hearing a celebration. Rather than getting thrilled about it, he has a point of view. He's perceiving something, but he has a point of view. It's humility, total humility that says, okay, God, change my point of view. And then it's like, having your hand around something really tight and God prying it off. But God, please change my point of view. I'm trying. Well, we'll come back to that in a minute. Jesus was actually relating here another adjustment to religious thinking, particularly the scribes and Pharisees, in other words, the religious scholars of the day. I want to go over to this verse here. This is in 1 Kings 8:46 through 50. Notice how similar it's going to sound to the prodigal son story. And when they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them and give them over to the enemy who takes them captive to his own hand, far away or near, and if they have a change of heart in the land where they are held captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their conquerors, and say, we have sinned, we've gone wrong, we've acted wickedly, and if they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and pray to you toward the land you gave their fathers, toward the city you have chosen, and the temple I have built for your name, then from heaven, your dwelling place, hear their prayer, and their plea will uphold their cause. Let me highlight a few things for you here. This is King Solomon speaking. We already have a sacrificial system that's built on rules and regulations that's his lens. Notice the assumption here. This is because Jesus says actually virtually the opposite. The assumption is when they sin against you, for there's no one who does not sin, and you become angry and give them over to the enemy. How many times we've even preached that from the pulpit? You better not sin. You don't want to open up the door to the devil because there's nothing God can do. But I can make it sound exciting and go, oh yeah, oh yeah. No. It's coming from that mindset. Then it says, if they have a change of heart and repent and plead with you. Plead with you? We have sinned. We've done wrong. We've acted wickedly. That's exactly what the younger brother was saying at this point to the father. If they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies. Right? He was in the pigsty when this first came. To the end. Then from heaven, your dwelling place, notice the sense of separation. Hear their prayer and their plea. Well, going back to the point. But when he came to himself. It's interesting because I love the way the Aramaic words it. When he came next to his soul, he realized something was calling him. Himself was calling him. A recognition of home was calling him. But notice what he says. Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Now, before we go any further with that, we'll talk about it again next week. The Father doesn't even acknowledge this statement. The old system was saying, this is what you need to be doing. No. Instead, something else happens. Meanwhile, the older brother, he was angry and would not go in. Here's the point. Both brothers had an incorrect view, a dreamland view, and both was based on a worldly view, even though they both wanted to go home and enter their father's house. The barriers in their minds were the imaginations they contrived. One thinking that he was not worthy enough, the other thinking that he was standing for righteousness and his father compromised holiness. Both these views Jesus put on display to show all of us how we can misconceive who God is. Everything we go through in this life is a dream. It's about unveiling and becoming ourselves and facing ourselves, coming to ourselves. Because you can't come to yourself without coming to God, and you can't come to God without coming to yourself. If not, you're just an idol worshiper. And yes, there are some idols with Jesus' name on there out there. It's how we'll respond to the inner reminiscence of home and how we awaken to it. Now, there's a truth about spirituality and revelation, and the revelation it brings regarding God, ourselves, creation, and our eternal home. I want you to consider this. We're not grasping a revelation of something we didn't know. Actually, we are remembering what we always have known. Let me say that again. We are not grasping a revelation of something we didn't know. Actually, we're remembering something that we've always known. If we were to go back to the last lesson, we were given an honest choice to leave and choose another path. God allowed us this privilege, knowing full well that if we were going to have an intimate relationship with him, which includes equality without subjugation, he had to let us go. In the same fashion, his love never changed, nor anything that we did could change his view of us. The egoistic serpentine result of our choice changed our view of us and our view of him. In allowing us to sleep in the delusion of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we in effect left for a dream world where we would encounter all the elements of that world, but in another form, distorted, different, almost a caricature. God gave us this privilege so our inner truth, our real origin, can be rediscovered by us and draw us back home. In the same way that we left with a choice, we're now allowed to return with a choice. Now, I mentioned earlier Star Trek type version of the other theology, for lack of a better word. Our misconstrued story, being exiled, communicating to a distant kingdom, waiting to be rescued, and then the end come. I love Star Trek, by the way. Just got done watching the second season of Star Trek Discovery. Loved it. Actually, you couldn't tell. Actually, there's a movie more in line with our story that probably is one of the most famous movies since cinema. It was based on a book that tells us this story. And that is none other than The Wizard of Oz. The story of wanting to go home again in a distant land. You know, at the beginning we find Dorothy desiring something other than her home, right? Somewhere over the rainbow. The challenge for Dorothy, if you think about it, go back and watch that movie at the beginning. She was so selfish. It was all about her. And the somewhere over the rainbow is because I'm so self-absorbed, I can't find the love I have right here. Even Miss Gulch, the wicked witch eventually, even Miss Gulch, if you go back and watch it, beautiful. She was annoyed because Dorothy was so doggone selfish, she wouldn't prevent Toto from eating her plants and chasing her cat. That's how self-absorbed Dorothy was. So Gulch shows up with a letter from the sheriff claiming this is what the law says. See the tree of knowledge of good and evil right in there. And what does her uncle and aunt do? Go ahead, give Toto. This was your choice, Dorothy. This is just like the father. Just give. I know it's not great. It wasn't the greatest moment. Of course, we then find Toto. He runs out, but as soon as this happens, see, Dorothy has made a choice to find satisfaction somewhere else. And what does she do? She winds up leaving home. And the second she leaves, a storm arises. And she meets this carnival magician who actually tries to get her to go back home. But something shifted. By the time she goes back home, it's desolate. She can't find Auntie Anne. They're all gone. Actually, they went in the storm cellar. But the point is something shifted because of the decision she made. Something's changed. The storm, and then finally she gets clonked on the head. She goes into the death sleep. And all of a sudden, the normal reality gets transformed into a dream world of illusion. And as this spinning, she winds up, interestingly enough, in this land right here. The land of Oz. And what her opening words are when she steps out of that house is, Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. We must be over the rainbow. In other words, hear me. The very world she imagined before she left home was the world she created and fell into. That's where we are. This is Oz, folks. Now, I'll speak to that a little bit more, but if you think about it, then you have the yellow brick road issue. One of the things she's told, stay on this yellow brick road. Don't get off the yellow brick road. Now, there's been some conjecture what the red brick road is, because the red brick road doesn't really exist in the book, but it does exist in the movie. And it wasn't just arbitrarily put there. And I would suggest to you, think of what the law is, because now the law and legalism, which was once actually Miss Gulch, now becomes the evil one, now becomes the enemy. Now we have an enemy. But when we lose sight of the rules issue, it's the enemy. So she's told, stay on the yellow, because if you get on the other road, you're going to be in that system. And within minutes after she arrives here, you're going to find the Wicked Witch appear. But take a look at what she appears in. Smoke goes up, and it's the identical color of the red brick road. Later on, the time capsule, same exact color as the red brick road. Her throne, same exact color as the red brick road. Finally, her three friends. Very interesting guys. One doesn't believe he has a brain. The other one doesn't believe he has a heart. The other one doesn't believe he has courage. If I were a king of the forest. All kinds of things we can think of. Maybe we should do a Wizard of Oz night at the house and talk about this afterwards. But there's all kinds of things here about these three friends that travel with her, that eventually she realizes she doesn't need them anymore because she's come to herself. There's a real powerful New Testament statement that Glinda says, and this is that final segment of dialogue in this scene. Glinda says, you don't need to be helped any longer. You've always had the power to go back to Kansas. Dorothy, I have, Scarecrow. Why didn't you tell her before? Glinda, because she wouldn't have believed me. Dorothy was trying to find it in the wizard, if you will, a false guard. Till Toto pulled back the curtain. Trying to find it by conquering the enemy. Because if you remember, her getting the broomstick of the Wicked Witch didn't achieve anything for her. But this is the world we live in. We're going to conquer the devil. The devil, we're going to do that. And that's the devil over there. And the devil's doing this. Stop. Step away from the Bible before you hurt yourself and somebody else. So she says, she wouldn't have believed me. She had to learn it for herself. And I'm sorry. The one thing true about spirituality, it's a coming to yourself. The Tin Man says, what have you learned, Dorothy? And she says, well, I think that it wasn't enough just to want to see Uncle Henry and Auntie Em. In other words, go back to heaven. It's that if I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard, because if it isn't there, now listen to this phrase, I never really lost it to begin with. Finally, later, she's back home, and you were there, and you were there, and you were there. Home, this is my room, and you're all here. And I'm not going to leave here ever again, because I love you all. And oh, Auntie Em, there's no place like home. You see, it's what the story is about. Home again. Our home is not a small backyard in Kansas. It's a limitless kingdom greater than this physical universe. Now, please note, I didn't say instead of this universe. This is only a very small part of reality. And because of our illusion fabricated by our self-centeredness, we think this is all there is. Isn't it kind of strange? We want Jesus to come back here. Why? Well, the Bible said, go back and reread some of those verses on why he's coming back. The whole story has never been about him returning here, really, but us returning to him. We've been trained to wait for Jesus, to come in the clouds, to transport us, rapture us away. So we gaze into the clouds, looking at the signs of the times, looking for to find biblical prophecies. And then the end would come, Jesus appearing. I think we need to consider our cherubims on the path to the tree of life. They said something very interesting in Acts chapter 1, verse 11. They said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking at the sky?" You know, when you're looking under every prophetic rock, what's going on in Israel right now? Looking under this prophetic rock. Well, this is happening, this, and now we finally have planes in the air. Those are kind of like the scorpion things in the book of Revelation. What am I still doing? I'm still looking to the sky rather than looking where the kingdom is. The Apostle John said it this way. Dear friends, now we are the children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. There's a direct connection between our likeness and his likeness. If you add the math to that, if you use this as a mathematical equation, the final outcome is 1. In other words, I can't tell him and us apart. That's his coming. I like what Francois did to this in the mirror. He says, his manifest likeness is already mirrored in us. Our sameness cannot be compromised or contradicted. Our gaze will confirm exactly who he is and who we are. His appearing is directly connected to our ability to see him within us. We see him because we see ourselves. And as a result, we've come home again.